Welcome to Awakening Within. I'm your host, Jill McPherson, and today we have a very fascinating topic, I would say. Some people might call it depressing or morbid, but my guest thinks different. Today we're talking about home funerals and death midwifery, and we're going to learn a lot about those two topics. But first, let me welcome my guest, Cassandra Yonder.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Let's first start off with that title of death midwifery. Is that, first of all, what you would call yourself, a death midwife? Mm-hmm. And then just elaborate a little bit, how did you get into this job and what it is?
Yeah. Well, right off the bat, I think that it's an excellent question just to sort of talk a little bit about the terminology, because death midwifery I would see as a field or a concept or a philosophy, like a really big umbrella that embraces a lot of different topics. So I call myself a death midwife, but to me that's not a description of a practice.
Okay.
It's not really a job definition. There's no specific criteria or certification to be a death midwife. It's more of a philosophy of a way of being. And so underneath that title, I do have specific jobs or roles that I play, such as a home funeral guide or a grief counselor. There's different hats that I wear. But yeah, so
a death midwife could be a multitude of different things,
absolutely,
is what you're saying. So it's
yes,
almost like an umbrella
exactly,
of different professions, and people kind of pursue what death midwifery is for them individually.
I would say so.
Say more?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, it's meant different things in different parts of the world over time. And even some of the sub-professions that I mentioned are not well standardized at the moment. So, I mean, this is all kind of old and new at the same time.
Right.
We're kind
bringing
of in a melting
back
pot.
Something that probably existed, for a long time in our history.
Yes.
But bringing it back, but still trying to figure out how to define what we bring back.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yes, exactly.
So, how did this start for you then?
Yeah. The more I think about that, the further back I go, and being currently pregnant right now, it's recently thanks. It's recently come to my attention to think back to the fact that my own maternal grandmother died around the time that I was conceived. So I think it's become more relevant for me over the years to imagine the fact that the womb that I grew in was a grieving womb. And they say that babies really are bathed sort of in their mother's emotions and bathed in the chemicals of feeling. And so I think for me, now I'm able to draw some connections, saying that's why perhaps I'm really comfortable with grieving people. It's not that I sort of enjoy their sadness, but it feels homey. It feels comfortable to me. It's kind of a starting point.
You're not scared of it. A lot of people, we're scared to be around grieving people. We don't know what to say. We don't know what to do.
That's
kind of want to avoid the whole topic altogether.
Oh, that's right.
But you're saying that you
and we're going to talk a lot about that today.
That's why I'm really excited about that.
Yeah.
And that's what you're saying. You're comfortable with the topic of grief.
I think so.
And people who are grieving, you're not out of your comfort zone then.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so. It's kind of it's a sense of home, and so I'm drawn to kind of the realness.
Right.
I'm not so much of a light talk kind of person.
Right.
I'm more comfortable getting right down to the deeper issues. So looking back, I think that's probably something that really has made this work comfortable for me.
Right.
And then also as my childhood, my first home was above the clinic. My dad is a veterinarian.
Okay.
So we lived at the animal hospital. So my playthings were the animals that were there at the clinic. And of course, it's an animal hospital. So the ones that really stayed were there because they were dying or because they were very sick. Mm-hmm. And so if I think of my life kind of spiritually, I think that was really where I sort of came to be me, was just in the presence of those animals that were dying. And they taught me a lot about what death is, about what dying is.
Right.
And I remember feeling confused by the human element, because there I was, with the dogs and the cats, and it was really palliative care. If I felt that my touching them or being with them was a comfort, I would do that. If I felt that they needed to be alone, I would. But then there was a lot of things that were really surprising to me about the reactions from their owners. Like, why did their owners not want to be there? I mean, why was I having sort of this privilege to sit? And then when death did occur, I didn't relate on any level to like a spiritual leaving of the body or anything like that. But I did relate to something that I can only really describe as like an acceptance.
Right.
I mean, it happened and it was okay. It was neither good nor bad. It just simply was. And I think that really had a profound effect on, on who I am. And so now I live as a homesteader.
Okay.
Yeah, so that means that we are trying to be self-reliant and self-sufficient, living from the land.
Right.
And a lot of that involves raising our own food and killing our own animals. So that's another whole aspect of death and dying there. So I've lived closely with death in those ways.
With both the transitions of birth and death, and
that's right.
And
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. There's a connection there too. Yeah. Yeah.
So now, do you have a training? Like, do you go take a course on death midwifery,
right.
or because obviously we have midwives in Ontario, and there's rigorous training that they need to go through to become one.
Absolutely.
So what is there for someone who wants to deal
with?
Well,
I think if I just sort of tell my story, then maybe later on we can get a little bit more into the criteria and the professionalization that's going on in the industry. But for myself, I went through school. I did a degree in gerontology and sociology at first, and then I did a master's degree in architecture. But I was really interested in social architecture, and my thesis project was on architecture for the elderly. So that sort of followed through, because otherwise my education and life experience seems like it's been all over the place. But anyway, then after that, I was living a really cosmopolitan lifestyle in downtown Toronto, and starting to get into the field of architecture, and it just didn't feel, I had one of those moments where I was on the wrong path in life, and really sort of craved a deeper connection to animals and to nature, and so I left those things. I got together with a person who kind of shared the same philosophy for me as a life partner, and we're together homesteading now with children. But anyhow, so he and I, went the more rural route and started to live on a farm.
Right.
And as I saw, it was a horse boarding farm. Okay. And so these young girls, age around, say, 9 to 12, you can picture a lot of, especially in this area, isn't there's a lot of horse girls around.
Yes, yes.
Well, I was amazed to just observe what went on in the farm, how fascinated these children were to see that these eggs, like they didn't believe that they could actually eat an egg from our chicken coop. And they'd be caring for their horses in the most intimate way, like providing care, for their reproductive tracts and whatnot, just in a really mature way. And something was coming out in these kids on the farm with this connection to nature and connection, as you say, to life and death, that I just saw as being really important. So at that point, I went back to school and I started to study death and dying in earnest. And so I went to the University of Western Ontario, offers a program in their thanatology. Thanatology is the study of death and dying. Okay. They offer a program called a Certificate in Grief and Bereavement. Okay. So I took that. It was several years thinking that I would be a grief counselor at the end of it. Right. So that would be probably the closest thing that you could sort of put your finger on as training in terms of death midwifery. And then there I was, a grief counselor. We kept sort of homesteading and eventually wanted to move our homestead to the East Coast, where land is less expensive and more beautiful. And so here we are in Nova Scotia, and I thought, well, I'll go get a job as a grief counselor. And jobs are difficult to come by, as everybody says they are, about Eastern Canada. And I kind of found myself sort of stuck and wondering like how this was all going to come together. I'd imagined maybe a retreat for grieving children at the homestead, taking advantage of this closeness with nature and life and death. I was kind of in limbo when the person who I probably would have considered my best friend at that point, of the people that we'd met, he lived on a homestead just up the road from ours and stopped at the gate to chat every time he went by, as people did. His name was Jeremy, and he died unexpectedly.
And how old would he have been?
He was 63. Okay. And this was about 3 years ago now. Yeah. So we heard about his death, and I went up to the farm, and I had kind of imagined going as a neighbor, just because that's what you do, right? Just go and see what needs doing and help out. And I'd also imagined myself a little bit as a grief counselor, thinking perhaps there's some kind of assistance I can provide for his wife, who I wasn't so close with at the time, but have since become good friends with. anyhow, I got to the house and I imagined that Jeremy's body would have been taken away because the first responders had been there and all of this circumstance surrounding his death had taken place. But in fact, there he was in the bedroom on the floor. His body was there. And I can only describe that I think, you know, we have this reaction to death, which is one of repulsion.
Right.
And I've come to know that it's in some ways a necessary repulsion. But on the other hand, my personal reaction, maybe because of the childhood experiences that I shared, was one of going forward. Like without thought or without any layers of what, you know, I should rationally do at the moment. My instinct was to go toward him and put my hand on his stomach and on his chest. And his wife was there and she was crying. And the next thing I remember realizing was that the minister was there in the room. There was maybe a police officer and some neighbors who had actually been part of trying to resuscitate him. Anyway, everybody in the house was conspiring to get his wife away from his body.
Yes, to save her, to rescue her from the grief and what was happening.
Exactly.
You're right.
Exactly. And we can totally relate to that, right?
Right.
And I can relate to it too. Like, you don't want to see someone suffering, but I think what we fail to realize, and this is really at the seat when we talk about death denial, I mean, this is really the heart of what it is that what we're facing is actually our own suffering.
Right.
And we think that we're protecting someone else, but we're actually protecting ourselves. It's very difficult to watch a woman crying over her husband's dead body.
Right.
And so we think, if we just take her out of this situation, it won't be happening anymore. All that's really happened is that we're not watching it.
Right.
Yeah. So for whatever reason, I could tell that what was sort of needing to happen was just that she be there with
support.
him.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I didn't really do anything other than make space for what I thought was sort of meant to happen at the time. I mean, I didn't take a directing role, although I think the other people who were there sort of felt that I was taking a directing role. It was
Interesting.
Really, yeah, really kind of
fascinating
interesting
story.
Yeah.
And we'll pick up where we'll pick up there when we come back.
Excellent.
Welcome back to Awakening Within. Today's topic is home funerals and death midwifery. And I've been speaking to my guest, Cassandra Yonder, about her experience as a death midwife and how she came to be in this career, we'll say. So we ended off before the break, your story about a neighbor who had passed, and you were there in the home comforting the wife whose husband had passed. And if we can just pick it up from there on then how that really got you more into this profession, so to speak. Absolutely,
because that was a really amazing and profound and life-transforming moment for me to be a part of that. So because Jeremy's death was unexpected, that means that it would be a coroner's case or a medical examiner's case. A coroner and medical examiner is the same title, it's just used differently in different areas.
Right.
So the medical examiner in Nova Scotia had to send their team of people to pick up Jeremy's remains. And because we're in Cape Breton and they're in Halifax, it took 5 hours for them to be able to come, which was really a blessing now that I look back and understand sort of more now. Yes. I mean, that's sort of
There are no coincidences, are there?
Exactly, exactly, right. Yes, that's so true. So while I was mentioning that Jeremy's wife, Sue, that the other people in the home were trying to, get her out of that situation because they were worried about her. They're trying to save her. Yes, exactly. But instead, what she chose to do at that time was something I'll never forget and never really feel it was so humbling, you know, to be a part of it. They had a quilt on their bed that was made from the cloth that was used at their wedding for the napkins. And we wrapped them up together. The family dogs were there. She was speaking with him and saying goodbye. And I remember all that really happened is she kind of started to sort of flip out, like, what's going to happen to the farm? Am I going to have to sell? And I said, you know, let's just slow things down to right now. What's going on right now is that this is the last chance that you'll probably ever have to be with Jeremy's body again. And that's what's happening right now.
Right.
So just what she did with that time was amazing. And I could really only compare it, in thinking back after the fact, I could really only compare it to feeling like I'd attended a birth. So I went home and I Googled death midwifery. I said, is there such a thing as this? Because, you know, this was really quite amazing to me. And that's where I sort of started to see some, you know, some trainings that were being offered and how it related to home funerals. And I'll get a little bit more into that anyway. But that was just remarkable, just what happened during that time. And as it turned out, the 5 hours, she had to be interviewed, you know, interrogated really by the police during that time. And people were really surprised that all of this was happening right there with his body. And yet it wasn't scary or gross. It definitely wasn't scary or gross. Of all the things it was not those two things. I had a child who was nursing at the time, and he was nursing right there. And pictures were taken. Yeah, it was really remarkable. So anyhow, his remains were taken away by the medical examiner. And then, so what happens next? A funeral, right?
Right.
Okay, so then this whole discussion comes up. And Sue said, well, Jeremy was a homesteader. He was a poet. He was a gardener. Just an amazing community-minded man. And she said, I think Jeremy's wish would be that he wouldn't want anything done by professionals that could be done by community.
Wow, that's profound.
Yes.
Yeah.
And as she kind of started to think about what that might mean, she kind of backed off and said, oh my gosh, I'm not in any state of mind to be breaking any laws or arguing for things that aren't meant to happen, or I just can't take that on right now. And I said, well, you know what? You know, I'm here, you know, your friends and family have gathered, you have a support network. I think your job is to identify the wishes that your family has and for us to see if we can make it happen. If we can't, we can't. Let's just see what happens.
Right.
So that started this crazy chain of phone calls, and can we bury him at home on his own land, which we did. Can we just take his body over to the church next door? One of the neatest phone calls was with the medical examiner in Halifax, who's since become a good friend of mine. And I said, you know, another friend called, what can I do? And I said, well, actually, can you go and pick up his remains from the morgue in Halifax? He said, sure, I'd love to do that. So my husband and some other friends made his casket out of wood in his own shop at home. And by this time, you know, a couple of days had gone by, and kind of a sense of excitement, for lack of a better word, had really sort of gathered, because there was all these things to be done. And the medical examiner said, gosh, this has really changed my life, dealing with you as a family, because she said, I'd never considered my career this way. Nobody has ever come to the morgue to pick up a body that they knew. We've never had someone come.
A loved one.
Yes,
come.
This has never happened. We've never seen a homemade casket out of real wood before. Like, this is just really transforming my idea of what it is that we do here. And they were amazing. Like, they wanted nothing more than to just meet our needs as best they could. So they ended up holding his body at the morgue, because we didn't have refrigeration at home. We were just problem solving all these things, right? So we ended up that he was brought home, and I know now in retrospect that we could have opened up the casket, we could have washed his body, we could have had some of his friends and relatives that weren't able to be there right on the day of his death. But his sons had no interest in that. And, you know, what had happened. And actually at the morgue, they sort of made me promise. I mean, I don't know what the legalities are around that now, but they'd sort of said, what we'll do is he'll be in the bag that he would be in after he was autopsied. And then we'd sent a quilt. He was wrapped in a quilt, and the quilt was put inside the wooden casket that was made, and that's how he was brought home. And so he was laid out inside his casket on the porch. It was wintertime. He was put on 2 sawhorses. The community was gathered for a wake and a celebration and a party. The next day, he was taken down to the local church in the back of a pickup truck, where there was a ceremony held. And after that, it was a great snowstorm, a fantastic snowstorm coming home. And then we'd had another neighbor with a backhoe dig the hole. My husband, who had some geotechnical training, had done some soil analysis or whatever, and we checked with the lawyer and made sure that a home burial, it just had to be changed on the deed. And so he was brought home, and Jeremy had 1 million farm implements lying around and about 20 shovels. So we shoveled the dirt back into his grave, which was one of the most amazing things I've ever done.
Wow.
And that whole experience was absolutely transformative for me on so many levels. But the part of me was my academic mind that I brought to it, which was actually applying grief theory.
Right.
And this has been the part that's becomes, of great interest to me, because exactly what you're saying about death denial, we have a system that conspires to protect ourselves from grief. It's as if we can gloss it over or not look at it or not see it, that we're not going to feel it.
Right.
Which is the exact opposite of the
Right.
philosophy of a home funeral. Because it is actually the problem solving. And more importantly, it's actually the physical presence and the physical, visceral work of caring for the dead,
Right.
which is actually the manifestation of our process of grief. And it leads to a very healthy grief response. Not
Right.
one that's not painful, not
Right.
one that's not scary,
Yeah.
not one that's not angering,
Right.
but one that is felt
Right.
and
Right.
experienced.
So it's not about the easy way out.
Right.
It's about the way through. It's about working through the pain and through the, anyone who's taken the psychology of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief, if the first stage is denial. And to be having those experiences that you just shared with us, that the wife would have had with having so much closeness and intimacy with his body, and being involved so prominently with what happened with the home funeral. That really feels like to me that she would be so almost like gently pushed through the denial of like, the reality was really there. Like she lived the reality of that he is now no longer in his body.
Exactly.
And so
Exactly.
interesting.
Yeah. Now you touch on Elizabeth Kubler-Ross there, and there's a number of stage and phase-based theories, which I'm not so much a proponent of.
Right.
But I do think that what she was addressing is that it's not just, before Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, it was sadness, and that was it.
Yes.
And she's addressing the fact that there are these different emotions that we bring to it. But another theory that I would probably even more aptly point out, to put it in that theoretical framework, is Warden's tasks of grieving.
Okay.
So, if a grieving client comes to me 10 or 15 years after a death has occurred, oftentimes the place that we're starting in our conversations together is just this realization that the death actually took place. It's like realizing that it even happened in the first place. So I think that's kind of what you're getting at too. It's a little bit about this sort of conspiracy to protect, and it's also about the experiential reality. Because if you think about someone who, say, is away at school or away for work, families live far apart from one another now, to get a phone call that says, your mother died, well, you take that in as a rational fact, but you have no felt experience to go along with that. So sometimes, our mind is a crazy place, right? And it plays tricks on us. So just to have that present awareness is really,
It's amazing.
It's phenomenal.
Now, not everybody has a homestead. Not everybody has the farm
Right.
to have, or maybe the space to have a home funeral.
Yeah.
So,
Or the support
or
network.
the support. So, would it necessarily always be in a person's home if someone was to have a home funeral?
No.
Or would there be other options?
I think what makes a home funeral is actually not the kind of definition that says this funeral A is a home funeral and this funeral B is not a home funeral. I think that what a home funeral actually is an attitude toward death. Because I would say that, the case I've described to Jeremy, as you say, that's an extreme example.
Right.
And I would sort of put myself kind of on that extreme end. Like for me, if my husband or my child died at home, to think that we don't hire a plumber, we have a homestead, we do everything that needs doing, we do for ourselves. Being self-reliant is our reason for being.
Right.
So to think that I'm going to then get on the phone and call a professional to come and wash my child's body for me, those are things I would want to do myself, not because I would necessarily enjoy them, but because
You feel the need to.
I feel the need to. And so to think that there's even laws, like if a family is in a car crash and a child is lying dead on the road, that's a court case. That's a coroner's case. So in actual fact, you don't have a legal right to your child's body in that moment. You're taken away, and then when they get the information that's needed, then you get a burial permit and this is handed back to you. But so I'm on this extreme end of I don't think any law or anything should get in the way of that. To me, that's just a fundamental base right of a person to their kin, that their body belongs to them.
Great.
But I wouldn't say that that's only the only home funeral.
Okay, well, we'll hear more about home funerals then when we come back.
Great.
Welcome to Awakening Within. I'm your host, Jill McPherson. We're talking about a very interesting topic today, home funerals and death midwifery. And if you're just joining us now, we've been talking specifically now about home funerals and what that might involve, sort of the definition and characteristics of. My guest today is Cassandra Yonder. Cassandra Yonder, and she's with us explaining how she helps people with home funerals. So when we went to the break, we were talking about sort of the continuum of home funerals, and you were sort of on one end, giving a lovely story about a neighbor who had a home funeral at home on the farm,
where everything was done,
where everything was done.
Yes.
And but there's another end of that continuum. Maybe you could help to shed some light on that too.
Yeah,
then.
because I wouldn't ever want to say this was a home funeral and this isn't a home funeral. So I would say that for a different family, just simply feeling that they're at the center of their own experience,
right,
I think is what defines that the home funeral, that the family unit, and I use that term family as a social scientist, meaning whoever the person might define as their family. So
right.
Community might be a more accurate term, but that the community itself is defining the experience.
Right, and
so,
not somebody else dictating this is the way it's going to go.
Exactly.
Right, okay.
So maybe the best way of saying it is that the services that are provided by a funeral director, I would like them to be seen more as a privilege than a necessity.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is that funeral directors are doing things for us that we assume we can't do for ourselves.
Right.
We assume that it's impossible, that it's gross, that it's dangerous and not safe, that it's illegal.
Yes, oh, for sure.
Yeah. So in fact, I would actually say that I wish people would see funeral directors a little bit more like wedding planners.
Right.
Like they might need this service.
Here's what I want in my wedding, so then here's what we want in the funeral.
Exactly.
And I think,
like you were mentioning the social support networks, or if someone lived alone, or if someone lived in a busy cosmopolitan area, they don't have a home, like all the things I described.
Yes, they don't have a homestead.
But they might still achieve a home funeral as long as they're making the call and saying, I need this service. Will you come and provide this service for me?
Right.
Which is, I think, a little bit opposite to the way that funeral care is directed now, which is, don't worry, darling. We'll take care of all of this for you.
We'll take care of it.
So it's that very subtle.
And that will take care of it is the best of intentions. I think behind that is somehow we'll reduce your suffering if we take care of it. We take care of it. And so people sort of surrender that of like, like my job now is to surrender all this to you to somehow I'll feel better.
Yes.
But yet, if you are sort of in the center of the home funeral of your loved one, then that is sort of working through that grieving process and being so intimately a part of it.
Totally, you've got it.
Yeah, yay. And I think that I think I've seen signs anyways. Yeah. Now I know you're in Nova Scotia now, but in Ontario, and my own personal experience, I think that we've I'm thinking particularly in a local funeral home where they are trying to definitely be more family-based, where the family is more involved in the decision making, and I'm grateful for that. But
Totally.
But back to the home funeral. So you're saying a home funeral can be pretty like a wide spectrum, just like the way a wedding could be.
I think so. I
a
think
wedding
it's a
can be
different
in your
philosophy.
backyard, and a wedding can be in a fancy banquet hall.
That's
so,
right.
You know,
That's right.
the funeral
There's no
can be,
formula.
Right.
Yeah, I think
So-
it's the attitude behind it. Yeah.
So basically, your role then is like if I lost a loved one,
Yes.
and I contacted you,
What
now-
would I do?
Yeah,
Okay.
pick it up from there.
So to tie that in, after this experience with my friend Jeremy that I've described, I went to a place called Final Passages in California.
Okay.
It's directed by a woman named Jerry Grace Lyons, who is sort of the grandmother of home, or one of the grandmothers of home funerals in North America. And so we did sort of 3 weekend workshops to obtain a certification.
Okay.
Now, on one hand, you could say the certification is sort of bunk, because the whole point of home funerals is that you don't need expertise to do this. It's about the family sort of in all of their messy problem solving, fumbling their way through it. And yet there is this, as you say, this kind of element of professionalism. So if you're going to go out there and say, this is my business,
Right.
what do you get? What are you offering?
Right.
Okay, so there's some stickiness there. Part of it is that you can't act as a funeral director without a license. I mean, that would be illegal for me to do so. So it's not legal for someone to be paid to provide direct hands-on care for the dead. And what the difference between a home funeral guide and an alternative or a regular funeral director is then that a home funeral guide is actually directing, empowering, and educating families to do it for themselves.
Okay.
So to answer your question, a lot of what I actually do as my job is this. You know, a lot of what I do is public speaking and just letting people know that
Educating that they have options.
that they have options. It's, you know, it's totally about choice, and you know, baby boomers are demanding that choice, and that's why we're seeing it incorporated into the typical industry of funeral care. But so a home funeral guide, you know, is educating a family to do it themselves, and so really my role is to figure out what support network is available to this family, what can they take on, and mostly to model acceptance of the situation.
Right.
So, and this is where it's really difficult to describe, because you might imagine phoning me and saying, you know, my loved one just died. What do I do now? Can you come over and wash the body? Well, I'd have to say, no, I'm not legally allowed to come over and wash this person's body for you. But what I will do is come over.
Okay.
And just by being there and being in that room with my friend Jeremy and realizing nothing crazy is happening. I mean, this is still real life. We're just grounding in the reality that's right now.
Right.
So sometimes just having someone there
Yes.
is really...
a calm presence.
Yes, is really
Yes.
what it is. Now, I might actually pick up a washcloth. There might actually be some physical work that I do, but that's all in the vein of educating. If I have the sense that a family is really not prepared to provide some aspect of care, then I help them to find the care they need. So there's a lot of different areas, like somebody needs to deal with the paperwork, getting the burial permit from Vital Statistics. These are the main areas of home funerals. Another area is, of course, with related to care of the body. So there needs to be some awareness of if there are any, you know, possibilities for contamination, which really the risks are they're there, but they're much less than the average person thinks that they would be.
Right.
The way I like to describe it is that if a person at end of life has been cared for, you know, for days or months or weeks or years, and they're lying in a bed, when they die, they're actually usually safer in terms of, you know, communicable diseases or whatever. But anyhow, the course of events that happens, it would never put a member of the public in contact with a communicable disease. So most of what's happening is just gently easing these fears, that it is okay to touch, that it is okay to talk, that it is okay to have regular life, like nursing, go on in the room.
Right.
And then there's transportation.
Okay.
That's another big issue. So I might help a family who wasn't prepared to put their loved one in their own vehicle, which is totally legal, by the way. I'm not sure province by province in Canada, but in Nova Scotia, once you have obtained a burial permit, it's absolutely legal to transport your loved one's remains in your own car. And you could go through a funeral director and get that service, or you could go just to a transport company. If that was the only service you needed, you could do that.
Right.
And then, of course, there's disposition. So you'd need to work with the family to figure out what is the appropriate disposition of this person's remains. You know, did they want to be buried? Did they want to be cremated? What are all the factors that are involved there for individual families? So a home funeral guide is a guide or an educator. A home funeral or a funeral director is someone who's actually providing service.
Right.
For a fee.
Right, and provides all of that.
Yes.
And so there would be a fee with you as well, though, when you mention fee.
Yeah, oh gosh, that's such a good question, and it's one that's really not resolved right now very well in Canada. And it's so difficult to explain. When I went away and got my certificate, I expected that I would come home and hang my shingle and that people would call me and I would, go and...
This is what I do.
Yeah, this is what I do. This is the fee. But it's not been that way. And it's not been that way, I think, for a number of... I live very remotely, so just the population... people still see it as something very new agey, even though, as you've said, it's an age-old practice. It predates the traditional funeral package.
Right.
I mean, this is what we've always done, is to care for our own loved ones at home. But yet, as soon as I make it into a sort of a service, it seems new agey. So there's not a whole lot of people that just kind of want to call and look me up in the yellow pages. Oh, I need a home funeral guide. So that's not been the route that it's gone. It's more been about public education.
Right. And
Yeah.
that's what you're more busy with. Is that what you said?
Yes, absolutely.
With the education.
Yes, absolutely.
Good.
Yeah.
But do you get people thinking this is a pretty morbid profession, and why would you want to do this?
Yes.
Or why would anybody really want a home funeral?
Yes. Yes, of course I do.
And how do you respond to that?
How do you explain why a homemade apple pie is better than a Walmart apple pie? Like, how do you explain that? I don't know. I mean, it's a connection to what's real. It's a connection to actually, caring for ourselves in community, producing our own food, birthing our own babies, and caring for our own dead. These are things that we've become, I would say, tragically alienated from.
Right.
And that's where I would go with that. For the people who think that it's gross, it's true. I mean, they're not wrong. Like, it's a scary... Jerry Grace Lyons talks about it as she loves to see families walk through that door of fear. Because, it is scary, and then suddenly you're there and you're doing it, and it's not anymore. I mean, when it actually happens, most people who've been through a home funeral have found it to be enriching and rewarding, you know, on all levels. But it's certainly nothing that I would ever try to convince anybody to do.
Right.
But to answer your question, I think back to, there's a woman in my community who runs the farmer's market.
Okay.
And she said that a client had remarked to her that there was, I don't know, dirt or a bug on the lettuce and the organic produce that he was getting from the... Well, yeah.
Yes.
Right? Like, that happens.
I know, and especially if you've grown... I was raised on a farm and we had our own garden. Yes, of course.
Yeah.
That's part of...
So if someone asked you, well, why would I choose dirty lettuce with dead bugs on it when I can get sterile lettuce? Like, how would you describe to them? Well, because.
Right.
You know? So,
yeah, it has to be... it's something that might feel... right to some people and maybe not so much others.
Right.
But it also has a lot to do with your belief systems and what you're used to, what you're growing up with. I mean, I grew up with it. Nobody touched a dead body. And so the idea of maybe being responsible for a dead body would be a little bit overwhelming.
Yeah.
But not even knowing that there could be potential benefits to that.
Yeah.
In my own grief and my own healing.
Totally. So that I'd like to spread that word. But, you know, you've said something there that I think is really important. I've followed the work of Steve Jenkinson quite a bit, and his description is that we're culturally bereft because we've left the deathbed. And we really have. I mean, when he's interviewed, he often begins by asking his interviewers, when you were 21, how many deathbeds had you attended? And usually between 3 people, there might be an answer of 1.
Right.
And so it's the fact that we haven't shown up for this, right?
Right.
That we're alienated from it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll pick up more when we
Okay.
come back. We'll be right back. Welcome to Awakening Within. We're back talking about home funerals and death midwifery, and my guest, Cassandra Yonder, is a death midwife herself. And we've had excellent discussion here so far, just amazing, and I really appreciate you coming in. So let's step back then and talk about that broader picture of midwifery, because as you said, it's almost like an umbrella of many different possibilities or professions or careers, that kind of thing. And we'll just try to shed light on that big umbrella and try to go from there.
Right. So where I would go with that would be to say that we've been talking about home funerals, which I would say, you know, you get a certification and it's kind of a job description. Whereas death midwifery is sort of the bigger picture, like you're saying. So in the UK, a death midwife is actually something totally different. A death midwife is someone who practices with individuals and families at end of life.
Okay.
It's kind of like how a hospice nurse might be considered here in Canada.
Like palliative care?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so this sort of person knows a lot about end stage dying, is very comfortable being present for the transition. And then there's other fields of interest that sort of break off from there, like spiritual midwifery, soul midwifery, psychopomps, shamans, so people who help the spirit to journey after death.
Okay.
And I would consider that all, you know, death midwifery. Now, in the United States, the term death midwife is sometimes used interchangeably with home funeral guide.
Okay.
So it's very different. So none of this is settled yet. Now, it's kind of my own personal interpretation to make it all this one sort of big umbrella that has all these different facets in it. But what I think ties all of those together is what relates, and why I think these terms, death midwifery, are essential, is because it relates it to birth midwifery in the sense that traditionally, you know, long ago, it would have been the same woman, typically a woman, acting in community who served both birth and death in these ways, served the transition, served the spiritual journey. So if you needed a
midwife, the same person would come if you had somebody pass as well?
Yes, oftentimes, yes.
The sort of pre-industrial time, that would, is that what we're talking about that?
Yes, oh, and ancient, you know, like forever.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's kind of the sort of.
Isn't that interesting? So it's about two transitions, isn't it? It's about the transition of birth, the transition of death. And so a midwife would have serviced both.
Exactly. And more critically, I think it's accepting the normalness and naturalness of the transition.
Right.
This is what appeals to me. When I think about a birth midwife, of course, this is a person that has, you know, medical training, right? Like they understand what's physically going to happen and they're there to help. But it's the psychology of how they provide that assistance is so totally different. So the way that I would describe that for me would be to say that a birth midwife accepts that birth is a normal and natural process.
Right. It's not an illness. It's not a sickness. Right.
Exactly.
Right. And
that it might necessitate medical intervention sometimes. If there's a problem, you might want to call a surgeon to do an intervention. It might require that sometimes, but it doesn't necessitate it. It's not as if the birth isn't going to happen if the OBGYN isn't there.
Right.
And I think it's that same philosophy applied to death, which creates this field or paradigm of death midwifery. It's anybody who accepts that death is a normal and natural transition, and that we don't need these services in order for it to happen. So it's like when I was saying a funeral director, it should be more of a privilege than a necessity.
Right.
It's like, we're going to dispose of our loved ones' bodies regardless of whether we're paying anyone to help us or not.
Right.
So if we are going to pay someone, like, let's be conscious about that. Let's decide what we can do for ourselves, or let's decide what we need help with and then ask for that appropriate kind of help. So that's how I would kind of compare. I mean, there's a lot of different, there's thanadoula, there's end-of-life doulas, end-of-life coaches, as I say, spiritual midwives, death. I mean, this terminology is just all over the place right now, but the reason that I'm connected to the words death midwifery is this concept that midwives, or the concept of midwifing something is, I think, essential.
Right.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here? Like, what do you see? You know, it sounds like we're bringing, you know, the past back kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like it's coming back.
Yeah.
And so, you know, is it now about us trying to sort of define and you know, it seems like there's this huge, as you said, umbrella of what a death midwife could be or provide.
Right.
And so now where are we heading with it? What do you predict the future of this?
Well, now we face all of this whole idea of professionalization, and here we are in the post-industrial age, and people want to know that professions are regulated, that there's a code of ethics. So we have to address all of that. Now, we're not really flying blind here, because in the United States there are some organizations who thankfully have taken the lead on this. And I'm the Canadian representative of the National Home Funeral Alliance. and they have a website, which I think you'll show for your viewers.
We'll have some of that coming up on the
and
screen.
that's a great first place to start for anybody who wants to get information about home funerals. It is based in the United States, and it's mostly American information, but it does provide contacts, that are relevant to Canadians as well. So what we really need to look at is both the professionalization of guiding home funerals and also the support and maintenance of what death midwifery is and how does it serve the public. So here in Canada, it's super exciting. I mean, tomorrow I have my first meeting with people that have contacted me through my website over the past 3 years. There's finally this critical mass, and we're meeting for the first time tomorrow to talk about a Canadian organization for death midwifery.
Great.
And I think that won't be a code of ethics or regulating body or anything of the sort. It will be, what do you offer? What's your practice? And how can we let the public know that that's out there and that it's possible and that it's legal and that it's okay and it's potentially therapeutic?
Right.
So that's really, really where we're at. We're at the beginning.
Right.
We're at the beginning, and I think that there is a leap to be made in terms of the fact that people see it as sort of mysticism or, new agey or occult. Mm-hmm. There is, I get a lot of that. A lot of people sort of turned off by imagining what it is that I might do. But for people who kind of realize that it's what their grandparents did, that's really the connection. There's a movie called A Family Undertaking.
Yes, yes, and we have that on one of our screens for our viewers to see, to look at. I did view that, and I thought that was amazing.
Did you? Yeah.
A Family Undertaking.
Yeah.
And that was on, do you remember what site that one was on?
I think if a person was to just simply Google A Family Undertaking, they would find the documentary.
Yes, yeah. And a personal story of somebody who experienced the home funeral experience and really shed light on that intimacy and the meaningfulness it had for them. But at the same time, obviously we need to point out that if anybody chooses the traditional home funeral option, that's fine too. Whatever anyone's comfortable with. There is no right or wrong here, is there?
I don't think there is. I mean, that might be a little bit stronger than I'd actually go with. I think that there are definitely benefits to coming closer to death in all ways. I mean, we don't need to put. If a grief counselor were to look back to a point in history where people were most successfully accommodating grief, where they had the healthiest grief, it's where grandma was sick in the living room and she died in the living room. Mm-hmm. And the family dug the hole and they made the food, not because they wanted to or because they had a philosophical belief system which led them to believe it was the right thing. It's because that's what you did.
Right.
Yet they benefited from that. So I wouldn't go so far as to say it's all equally good.
Right.
I would probably more say, let's, as we are, as a culture, as you are by doing shows like this, let's investigate this death denial and just see where it takes us, see where opening to this takes us.
Because we don't know what we don't know, do we?
Right.
I mean, we don't know that there potentially could be a huge benefit in being more centered in the whole funeral and grief process.
Right.
And that, the whole idea of kind of being saved of, take the body away and save me of this. Yeah. We don't know that actually could be robbing us of some essential healing to work through.
And that point that you've just made reminds me that in the States, there has been some animosity between home funeral guides and funeral directors. Quite a bit of animosity and some litigation, and it's quite a messy thing. But I think you said it best earlier today when you mentioned that funeral directors are actually offering packages that are closer to reflecting sort of home funeral principles. And to be completely honest, I mean, I think that really is the future of home funerals. Yeah. Funeral directors are automatically going to offer what people want because it's what people want. So I don't see that there needs to be an animosity between these two professions. Not. I think that their absolute cooperation and collaboration is possible.
Yeah, isn't that saying on the other spectrum, we have midwives and the OBGYN, and again, can be some animosity there too.
Right.
And yet really, collaboration would be the ideal, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, to bring it full circle, I'm having my baby in Nova Scotia. At the beginning, you asked about midwifery care, and I know here in Ontario they've been quite successful to bring them together, haven't they?
Yes, it's wonderful to have that.
Yeah.
So, what would you say, just with about a minute left, what would you say to families who would be interested in having more of a home funeral-based type service or arrangements with their loved ones that have passed? Where would you suggest they go?
Well, first of all, to look at some pre-planning makes it sound like a going to talk to your funeral director. So it's not just that. It's more than that. I'm talking about advanced planning, advanced care, conversations, having conversations with your family about all of this stuff, about what your wishes are, and the internet is just a fantastic resource. If you Google home funerals,
they'll get a lot.
You will get a lot.
Yes.
Yeah,
well, I want to thank you for coming,
Thank
especially all the way
you.
from Nova Scotia.
Thank you.
That was lovely that you were able to come, and I understand it's pretty much one of the first shows of having a home funeral.
You're to be congratulated.
Yay.
Yes.
Here in Orangeville, that's great. And I want to end the show with a quote that actually Cassandra had given me, and that is, "How we die and how we care for dying people and who our dead are to us. These are what make us human. These are our real culture, these are where our real culture is made or lost. Dying is where we can plant our feet in the world and live. Dying is village making." And that quote's by Stephen Jenkinson. And I want to thank you for watching. Namaste.
Namaste.